Well, hello there, American history students. Those of you that are at home because you're sick, or maybe you've missed class because you were at an event or something. Well, I wanted to make sure you had a record of our notes just in case you missed class. So let me get this information down for you. Remember that you can always pause it, or you can skip ahead to the section that you need for your particular day that you missed, because typically we do these notes in 2 or 3 days, okay? All right. Well, the theme that we're going to talk about today is Western expansion into Indian land. And when I first decided how to do these notes, I was really struggling because the white man actually broke 370 treaties with Indian people. So the hard thing was deciding, okay, which ones do I choose? Do I choose just the big ones, or do I focus on an area, or what? And I think probably the best way for us to do this is to focus on the ones for our particular region of the country. So I focused on treaties that only affected Dakota Territory and then eventually South Dakota, because I think it'll help you understand your state even more. In fact, we refer to certain parts of the state because of the treaties. So that's what we're going to look at. And that'll be a great example to show you how things work. Okay? All right. First of all, I want to go over 4 main tribes that I know you need to know for your test. You'll notice that these are at the end of your notes. So we're going to do that first and then go into the treaties that are in South Dakota, okay? Now, the first main tribe we've already studied, and that is the Lakota. Notice it starts with an L, right? There's the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. The Lakota lived right here in South Dakota, in particular in the Black Hills, but they did live right where we are standing today, right here in Brandon and Valley Springs. But here's where they ran into conflict. Their big issue where we ran into conflict was that soldiers were out in the Black Hills, and while they were there, they discovered gold in the Black Hills. And word got back to the East Coast that there was so much gold you could hardly carry it all out. And so people came rushing to South Dakota or to Dakota Territory and wanted to go and find their fortune. Well, there were 2 groups of the Lakota. They kind of split on what to do. White man said, you need to go to a reservation. And half of the Lakota said, okay, we'll do what you say. And that was with Red Club. He said, we've already lost enough lives in our tribe. We need to just get along. But the other half said, no, you can't tell us what to do. We're going to fight. And they followed Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse that you see over here on the right side of your screen. And so they refused to leave. And they went and they lived out in the mountains, out in the hills of Dakota and Montana area, basically, and refused to leave until Colonel Custer was sent to remove them. That's kind of the big event that they're known for. Our second main tribe are the Nez Perce. These are a Northwest tribe. They lived up around Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. They were really well known for what was called the Thief Treaty. They were also told that they were supposed to be put on a reservation, and the people said, nope, we're not going to go there. And so they tried to run instead. And they started running and running and running, covered over 1,500 miles. And the soldiers chased them all the way across the country, up across the northern part of the country, up by the Canada border. And eventually, they did finally give up. And at that point, Chief Joseph said one of the most famous quotes in history. He said, I will fight no more forever. And at that point, the Nez Perce kind of disappeared off the map a little bit. So they gave in. Our third main tribe are the Cherokee. And we've talked about them a little bit. Remember, we played the song for you about the Cherokee Nation being forced onto the reservation. Okay. They were a southeastern tribe, primarily over here in Tennessee, Carolinas, Kentucky, that area there. Now, their chief at the time of this major event was actually a Scottish mixed blood. So he was part Indian and part Scottish. So his name was Chief John Ross. Remember that the Indian tribes on the East Coast had already been with white people for a while, so they are more used to white ways, have white names, things like that. Well, people started expanding along the coast, and they decided that they wanted to live where the Cherokee lived. And so the president said, you need to move out and go to Oklahoma. So they basically took what is now the state of Oklahoma and made it a complete Indian reservation. The whole state, other than the Panhandle, was an Indian reservation. And they were told to move. Long story short, they actually fought us in our own system, which is really kind of cool. They went to the Supreme Court and said, you can't make us move. We've lived here, blah, blah, blah. The Supreme Court actually did the right thing. And they said, nope, you can't make them leave. Well, President Andrew Jackson was president at the time, and he was a little bit against the Indians, let's just say that. And he said, fine, good for you, Supreme Court, but how are you going to enforce it? Because I am commander-in-chief, and I have control of the military. And so he basically disobeyed the ideas of the Supreme Court. He took his soldiers and he forced the Cherokee to march all the way from where they lived there all the way over to Oklahoma. We know of this today as the Trail of Tears. It was said that there were bodies just dead lying along the side of the route. They died of conditions. It was freezing cold. Supplies didn't arrive. They were starving. It was just horrible. They lost about 4,000 people on the Trail of Tears, just the Cherokee in that case. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And our fourth main tribe are the Dakota, that aren't too far from here either. They're just across the border over in Minnesota, southwest Minnesota to be exact. I'm from Marshall, Minnesota, so they would have lived right about where I used to live. And they are known for this particular story. By this time, they're living on a reservation or an area, and they were told to start farming. These people were not natural farmers, but they were trying to live the way they were told to do. But the agreement, according to the treaty, was that the soldiers were going to provide supplies for them to survive. They would give them blankets and clothing to stay warm. They would send them food so that they could survive. And the supplies were not arriving. And so the Indians went to the soldiers at the fort and said, hey, listen, we're starving to death. And one of the white officers said to them, let them eat grass. Kind of a famous story in Indian history. And as a result of that, the Indians got very angry and they attacked. It was called the Dakota War of 1862. And they started to attack white settlers who lived around the southwest Minnesota area. As a result of that, the soldiers rounded up as many Dakota warriors as they could find, and they brought them to Mankato, Minnesota. How many of you have been to Mankato before? Yeah, I've been there. Boy, I can't count how many times I've been to Mankato. I had no idea that this actually happened, but in that town was the largest mass execution in U.S. history. They rounded up 392 Indians, and they ended up hanging 303 of them, all at the same time. If you see the picture up here, that big square, that's what it looked like. It was right in the middle of town. They put a big old hanging square and they hung all of them in front of the people. The only reason why 392 were not hung is because Lincoln was president at the time, and he pardoned some of them and said, no, they were not around at the time of the actual attacks. So it was a very ugly time of history. The leader of the Dakota at the time, by the way, was this guy right over here, Chief Big Eagle. Very sad story. Okay, so now let's jump back to our notes at the beginning. Now you kind of know our four main tribes, and you'll need to know those on your test and map them basically on a map. All right, if you look at the treaties that affected Dakota Territory, or actually any of the 370 treaties, as time goes along, you'll see they all follow a basic pattern. It's really odd, but it's true. The first and the oldest treaties were basically, please let us cross your land. That's all we need to do. We want to go across it. So can anybody think of something important that happened in 1849? As in the 49ers? Yep, you got it. The California Gold Rush was one of the first things that started these particular treaties. All they wanted to do was go all the way across to California. They didn't care about this stuff in the middle, but they wanted to be able to get there safely and not have Indians attack the people as they went. So right about that time, they just said, we don't care, stay where you're at, can we just cross? All right, so part of that was because of like the gold rush. The second steps to the treaty happened because as people crossed this area here, they saw all the buffalo, for example. They saw all the good hunting. So they said, well, can we stop and do some hunting because we need food along the way? Well, remember that in particular, the Lakota here in Dakota Territory, they were nomads. They followed the herd and they lived off the herd. So it was a pretty big deal for them to share that, but the Lakota didn't see ownership of land. They just said, you know, the gods basically made this all for us and it's beautiful and we should all share it. So they said, sure, for the most part, okay? So in particular, we're talking about the buffalo. The third step was because people started realizing, number one, there wasn't as much gold over here in California, and people started wanting to settle down here in the middle of this land and make little houses and farms. So they said, how about we live on that land together? Can you imagine how well that worked? Yep, not very well, because they didn't speak the same language, they didn't have the same culture, and they were afraid of each other. You know, the Dakota story we just talked about in southwest Minnesota is a great example of that. You know, they were living in the same area, but they didn't understand each other. They were scared and they started shooting and they killed each other. So didn't work very well. So because that doesn't work, now the government says, I'll tell you what, we're not living well together. So I'm basically going to pay you money for your land or supplies for your land, and we're going to move you to another piece of land. And usually that other piece of land is not as valuable. It has poor soil, or there's not much hunting in that area, whatever it might be, but they were moved to another piece of land. And here's the deal. You might as well take this pay, because if you don't move when we tell you to, guess what? Then we're going to use force and we're going to make you leave and you won't get paid. So one way or the other, they were going to make them move. And the last step is even worse. So now we've moved you onto a reservation. Let's say they moved them all to Oklahoma, like we did with the Trail of Tears. Well, now people want to settle in Oklahoma because it has that beautiful red soil. So now we want your reservation, so we're going to make you actually move again. And they moved them further into other places that were also much smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's kind of the pattern as to how everything went. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the treaties that specifically affected South Dakota. The very first one was early in the 1800s, 1830s and 40s. It was called the Indian Removal Act. And basically what it did, it removed various eastern Indian tribes to Oklahoma Indian Territory. Remember when we talked about the Cherokee? This is that particular event that we were talking about. It was known as the Trail of Tears. The actual removal happened in the 1830s. Here are some of the main players in the story. This guy right over here that you see is John Marshall. He represented the Cherokee in those Supreme Court cases that we talked about. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just know that there were two of them, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia. And they actually won both cases. The Supreme Court sided with the Indians and said, no, the Cherokee do not have to move. But as I told you, Andrew Jackson was the president. He said, well, good luck to you, but who's going to enforce it? Because I basically control the military. And so the president sold the land and he forced all of them out of their homes. So let's take a look at the Trail of Tears. A lot of people think the Trail of Tears just included the Cherokee. But if you look at this, you will see that there were lots and lots of different tribes that were affected. I mean, look at down here. We even have the Seminole tribe down in Florida, Florida Seminoles, you know. They actually were brought across the Gulf of Mexico and all the way up and into Oklahoma. We have all the Cs. We call these the Sea tribes. At least that's the way I remember them. We have the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Cherokee. They all moved over. But we also have a bunch up north here. Up here we have the Omaha, the Missouri, the Sauk and Fox, the Iowa, the Kickapoo, the Shawnee, the Sauk, gosh, I can hardly read that. The Miami, the New York Indians. You'll see there's a whole bunch of them that were moved over as well. So let's look at a couple of examples. First, the first to actually move were the Choctaw. Let me clear this up so you can see it a little better. They took this trek in 1831. They were exposed to the weather, the cold weather, cholera, malnutrition, and of course the supplies did not arrive. And so many of them died on the trek. The second major group that left was in 1836, the Creek tribe that you see right over here. Okay. They had 3,500 that died out of 15,000 that walked all the way over to Oklahoma. In 1838, the Cherokee walked all the way from Georgia to Oklahoma, and they had 4,000 of 17,000 die, which is why most people remember them and write songs or poems about them. They took a real hit on this travel. And another just interesting fact that I discovered as I was studying this, 1,000 slaves also died in the Trail of Tears because they had slaves that were carrying all of the goods and stuff as they went with the soldiers. And so they died as well because of the conditions. It was said that there were just bodies riddled all the way along the trek. You'll also notice that a lot of these trails come together in certain areas. Why do you think that is? Think about the terrain. You're right. Good. Because right along here is a river, right? We know about that river. It's in our territory. Well, there were only so many places that had bridges where you could cross it. So that was where they actually crossed across the river and went into Oklahoma. Good. Okay, let me clear off some of my writing here so that it doesn't affect our next picture. It's the only bad thing about using this version. So I just wanted you to see what the Indian reservation would look like in Oklahoma. You'll notice they kind of divided them up by the different tribes. I think that's something that people didn't understand as white people back then. When they saw an Indian, they thought all Indians were the same. And they didn't understand that if you look at this book that I have right here, this includes all of the tribes in North America. And it's about as thick, oh gosh, those of you at home, it's about 2 inches thick. I used it in one of my college classes. And it just amazes me. In fact, if you hand around this poster here, you'll see all these different tribes, how they have different buildings and shelters. They even look different. They're made of different things. Their crafts and their weapons were made differently. And even the look of the people was different. You know, they were not the same. They didn't speak the same language. A lot of them were warlike and hated each other, and yet they were pushed into this little area and told to get along. It didn't go very well. The next major event that happens is the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now I'm going to warn you, there's 2 treaties of Fort Laramie, so you're going to have to study these for your test, okay? Just so you can keep track. The first one grants the Sioux Nation 60 million acres, including all of South Dakota, as long as white men could build roads through their territory. And again, why were they crossing it? Yes, because of the gold rush. Good. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. This is a legal document signed by both parties that says that the tribe owns all of South Dakota. Now, by law, if you look at a legal document, I guess they could argue that they own our entire state. Kind of interesting. This is what the Treaty of Fort Laramie looked like. If you look at all of this area here in white, that was all theirs. All of it. Because remember, they were nomads. And so the white soldiers were trying to make sure that they had room to be able to move along with the herds. Lots of territory. This is actually a picture over here on the right of people that were there for that particular treaty. The next treaty happened in 1858, and this was called the Treaty of Washington, D.C., because obviously it happened in Washington, D.C. This was a transfer of about 11 million acres east of the Missouri River, 430,000 acres near Fort Randall, and continued over ownership of 600 some acres near Pipestone in Minnesota. How many of you have gone up to Pipestone? Maybe seen some of the tribal stuff up there? Yeah. So I think it's interesting that they even recognize little Pipestone that's 45 minutes away from here. The next major treaty is 1868. This is the second Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now, by looking at this gorgeous picture, what landmark do you see that's involved in this treaty? The Badlands, yes. We know it very well in South Dakota, don't we? Well, the 1868 Second Treaty of Fort Laramie really adjusted land quite a bit. It basically created a 26 million acre reservation, which is about the western half of South Dakota. So here's what they said. We want you to live on this portion, this yellow portion that you see here in this picture. But we will allow you to hunt on the rest of South Dakota. So they could go over here in Brandon's area if they were following the herds. That was allowed. Didn't go well, but it was allowed at the time. Now, what do you guys sometimes call people that are from Rapid City? You say they're West River, right? This is where East River and West River come from. Because at this time, East River was white territory, West River was Indian territory. So it goes all the way back. And what divides us, basically? You got it, the Missouri River goes right along here. Now notice that there are forts all the way along the outside, trying to make sure that the Indians are doing what they're supposed to do. So we've got Fort Sully over here, Fort Thompson here, Fort Laramie, Fort Kearney, Fort Phil Kearny up here, Fort Lincoln up here. They're making sure they're staying in that area. By this time, the Indians are realizing that the white soldiers don't always do what they promised they're going to. Because just how many years ago, they promised them the entire Dakota area, and now they're already cut in half. So the Indians got smart, and they put a stipulation in this legal document that said, this treaty can only be altered by vote of 3/4 of all the Sioux men agreeing to change it. Because they saw that we lied and that we would change things. Smart play by the Native Americans. Now this is going to come back to haunt the government later on. We're going to see this coming back later, so remember this. Now we also need to talk about the buffalo, because as we said, the Lakota in particular were nomads, and they followed the buffalo herds. And they used every part of the buffalo that they could. They felt if we're going to kill an animal, because they considered an animal very sacred and valuable, we're going to make sure it's not a wasted experience. We only kill to use what we can. Okay? That's why they were so mad when they would see these rotting carcasses And here the white guys the traders would just take the fur, leave the rest of the meat rotting on the prairie. They thought, what a terrible waste and stuff like that. So I bet you guys have studied this before. Can you think of some ways that they use the buffalo? Let's take a look here. Wow, look at all this stuff. Well, first of all, let's talk about the hide. This hide here, most famously, is known for teepee covers, right? They also use them for moccasins, cradles, robes, shirts, you name it, dolls even. Now this rawhide, tougher hide, right, was used like for belts, medicine bags, drums. You've probably seen a drum like that, saddles, bullet pouches, things like that. The muscles, kind of interesting, I didn't know this, but they used it for jerky because, of course, it was tough. They also used it for strings on their bow. That muscle really extends out and it's strong. The horns were used for spoons and cups and things like that. The brains were actually used for hides because there was oil in them, and they would use that oil to grease down the hide and make it waterproof. Kind of interesting. The skull was used mostly for religious ceremonies. They would use it up on an altar of some sort. The tongue was considered the delicacy of the meal. Absolutely, it tasted the best. The hair was used for headdresses, but I thought this was really interesting. They used it for pillows, stuffing pillows, for ropes, because they could braid it, and even for halters on their horses. But the organs were also used, right? Stomach was used as buckets, cooking pots, cups. A lot of you maybe said you heard they used them as canteens. That's true. Dung, what is dung? Yeah, it's poop. It was actually burned. They called them buffalo chips. Well, we called them buffalo chips, but they were burned for fuel for the fire. They were also used for fertilizer with food and farming. That was more so the whites, but some Indians also use that. The bones were used for knives, arrowheads, shovels, anything tough. The fat was used for soap or cooking oil. Even the tail was used for like a fly brush or whips, things like that. And one of my favorites that I never forgot was they actually used the privates of the buffalo for baby rattles, because when they would dry it, it would have these little stone-like things inside, and when they would shake it, it would go. So they would use it as a baby rattle, believe it or not. Now that's totally grossing you guys out right now. Yeah, there you go. So they used every part that they could, for sure. So the question is, why did whites decide to start hunting the buffalo? There's three main reasons. Can you think of any of them? Number one, the railroad was being built across the prairie. Have any of you been out in the Black Hills and you run across some buffalo that are across the road? What do you have to do? Yeah, they're not going to move until they want to move. So you basically have to just sit there and wait. Well, that's exactly what was happening with the railroad. They would cross the area where they wanted to build their railroad, and they would get in the way because there were millions of them. And so they would hire hunters to kill as many buffalo as they could just to get them out of the way, which is really sad when you think about it. Second, things were becoming special over in Europe. It was all the rage, ladies, all the fashion in Europe to have a buffalo fur on, and it was actually a delicacy in England to eat buffalo tongue. So they would take the fur, take the tongue, and leave everything else to rot on the prairie. The third reason is the same reason some of you hunt today. Why do you hunt? For sport, for fun. Now, hopefully you eat what you hunt, but it was for fun for them. In fact, look at some of the records back in the day. By the way, as you're looking at this picture, I hope you realize these are all buffalo skulls. How sad is that, right? In fact, if you look at the entire picture, this is kind of zoomed in. There's a guy standing on top of this mound that isn't even shown. But let's look at some of the records. 120 buffalo killed in 40 minutes. That's 3 per minute, right? 6,000 killed in 60 days. Now, at the end of the Civil War, they believed there were 12 to 15 million buffalo that lived. By the time it was like 1934, they were almost completely wiped out, extinct, like nothing left. We are getting them back into a little more of a healthy number. They're still not extreme, but we do have some people that are raising buffalo out West River. In fact, how many of you have had buffalo steak or buffalo hamburgers? Yeah, and it's really healthy meat for you. It's actually healthier than hamburger. So it's good stuff. A little more expensive, but it's really good. Excellent. Now I want to ask you hunters a question. How many of you hunt in here? Raise your hand. Okay, so I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think it is easier or harder to kill a buffalo or a deer, and why? Okay. All right, so he said that he thinks it's easier to kill a deer because the hide isn't as thick. They're not as big of an animal. Yeah, these things weighed like 2,000 pounds. So they are really hard to slow down. Very good. Okay. You have a differing opinion. You would say the buffalo is easier because they're slower. Yep. They're bigger, so you have more of a shot. Good. You know what? You're both right. Actually, I just wanted to point out the features. It was very difficult to bring down a buffalo because you had to hit them in just the right place. In fact, there were certain bullets that would actually bounce off their hide because it was so thick. So you had to hit it just right with the right kind of gun. But they would also come in these herds, and they would just bam, 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 shoot them as fast as they could get the gun loaded, basically. So once they got them in the right aim and that kind of stuff, then they were a little bit easier to kill because they were slower. Now they're kind of like elephants. They start out slow to get moving, but once they get moving, they are kind of scary, and they can run you over and be very dangerous too. So that was also a problem. All right, so this is actually day 2 here. We just watched an episode where we talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. And I wanted to show you exactly what that looks like because they talked about ocean to ocean. Well, understand that by this point, there already had been railroads coming as far as Omaha and Minneapolis. Okay? So we already had that far to the Missouri River. The problem was we didn't have this part of the country covered. So they basically created 2 teams, and they were racing to the finish. The finish is right here, Promontory Point, Utah. That was the final mission. And they were always competing about how many miles did you get done today? And so bad that people died. They actually worked them to death. They used immigrants. They used people they didn't care about, people that weren't connected to family, and they would just work them to the bone. So now we're basically going from ocean to ocean all the way on the other side. You'll notice that on the right side in red, that's the Union Pacific. On the green side over here is the Central Pacific. And which one is shorter? Central Pacific. Yep. Why do you think that is? Exactly. Because they had mountains to go through, much tougher terrain. They had to cover the mountains right over here in California and mountains over in here. And then they had to go across desert actually to get there. So not saying it was easy for these guys to go through because they also had mountains here. But this area here across, well, Nebraska, pretty nice actually. But the left side had a much tougher time going through all the stuff we saw in our video.